Towards the end of the year of 1758, the tide in the North American theater of the war strongly favored the British. Despite losing yet another battle to General Montcalm at Ticonderoga, the British were able to achieve decisive victories at the Battle of Louisbourg and the Battle of Fort Frontenac. General Jeffrey Amherst made plans for the 1759 military campaigns that included an expedition to capture Fort Niagara, a major French military supply point between the French province of Canada and their forts in the Ohio Valley. Amherst chose Brigadier General John Prideaux to lead the expedition, which also included Sir William Johnson. Fort Niagara had been constructed under the direction of Captain Pierre Pouchon of the French Army. In early 1759, General Louis-Joseph the Marquis de Montcalm and the New France governor, the Marquis de Vaudreuil, sent with him about 2,500 men to fortify Niagara beyond the 500 men that had stayed in the winter there. Pouchon, under orders from Vaudreuil, sent many of those men south to Fort Montcalm in mid-June as part of a plan to reinforce the French forts of the Ohio country and attack the British at Fort Pitt. The forces left to defend Niagara consisted of about 200 men from the regiment of the Royal Roussillon, Longueuil, and Lancers, 20 artillerymen, and about 300 provincial troops and militia. Prideaux's British Army troops consisted of the 44th and 46th regiments, and 2 companies from the 60th, numbering about 2,200 men in total. Delayed by high water on the Mohawk River and the late arrival of some of the provincial companies, the expedition did not begin leaving Schneidy until mid-May. On the 27th of June, the army arrived at Fort Oswego, where they were joined by William Johnson and about 600 Iroquois. Leaving men behind to garrison Oswego, Prideaux departed on July 1st for Niagara with about 3,200 men, while the French had ships patrolling Lake Ontario for British movements. An attention on the part of one of the crews allowed the British flotilla to avoid discovery. They arrived at Fort Niagara on July 6th and landed near a marsh out of sight of the fort. Upon arriving, they immediately began siege operations. Inside the fort, the French had about 100 Iroquois allies at the fort who withdrew to meet with fellow Iroquois who had accompanied the British. Captain Ponchou directed a vigorous defense. During the battle, the British commander Prideaux was killed when a shell fragment from one of his own guns hit him, and the command of the British forces fell to Sir William Johnson. Johnson was a provincial officer and not in the regular army, and thus there was some question of his right to take command. But Sir William Johnson, held a royal colonel's commission in his role as commander of the Iroquois auxiliaries, and so he insisted on remaining in command after a lower-ranking regular officer, Lieutenant Colonel Frederick II, arrived on the scene. After several days of bombing, the French capitulated on July 26th. After they were given news of a French release force that was defeated, at a small battle outside of La Bella Famula, 2 miles south of the fort. The capitulation of Fort Niagara occurred on the same day that French troops abandoned Fort Carillon to an overwhelming British army under General Amherst. Following the surrender of Fort Niagara, the French abandoned other forts in the frontier, recalling garrisons to defend the more populated areas of French Canada. The forts abandoned by the French included Fort St. Frederick in present-day Crown Point, and Fort Réal in present-day Toronto. Fort St. Frederick was destroyed as French troops abandoned Lake Champlain to protect the Canadian heartland. The garrison at Fort Réal was instructed to evacuate the area and burn the fort should Fort Niagara fall. After the British captured Fort Niagara, the French garrison burned Fort Réal and withdrew to Montreal. The remaining French forces in the Ohio and Illinois country were eventually turned over to the British forces. In the Indian theater of the war, the British Army under Francis Ford moved to the French-held port at Maxen. Ford's army held a good number of Indian mercenaries employed by the British East India Company. They reached the city on March 6th and began the siege on the small French force under Comte Conflans. The French force only lasted about a month before being forced to surrender to the British Army. This gave the British Army yet another major port in the British Indian theater of the war. The Prussian army under Frederick the Great suffered a devastating defeat at the Battle of Hochkirch. He was terribly outnumbered, having 3,600 men to Daun's 8,000 men, who took care of the Prussians quite easily. Perhaps the worst consequence of the Battle of Hochkirch was the death of Field Marshal James Keith. After the loss of his good friend Field Marshal Keith, Frederick read a speech of Racine's Madrith, a play based on the late Roman Republic. He ended by saying the words, "I have met defeat." And he broke off, visibly upset, and sobbed at the death of his good friend, Field Marshal Keith. The loss at Hochkirch forced Frederick back into Silesia. They were forced into retreat, losing nearly 9,000 men. It was a devastating defeat for Frederick. As Frederick wrote of the disappointing year of 1758, "My great difficulty is this. In previous years, our enemies have failed to act together, so that they could be fought one after another. This year, they have intended to act simultaneously." During the winter of 1758 and early 1759, Frederick embarked on a vigorous recruiting campaign. By the start of 1759, he held an army of nearly the same size as he had a year prior, though these soldiers were not nearly as experienced as the war-hardened Prussian soldiers who had died in the battles such as Zorndorf and Hochkirch. The quality of the Prussian soldier had diminished greatly. In the spring of 1759, the Prussians launched several hit-and-run raids in the Bohemian electorate, destroying the supply lines of the Austrian army under Daun in the region. The raids were at least good enough to stifle the Austrian army from launching another offensive into Prussia. On April 14th, in the Western Theater of the European War, the Anglo-Prussian army under the Duke Ferdinand of Brunswick suffered another bad loss at the hands of Duke de Broglie at the Battle of Bergen. This allowed the main forces under the command of Marquis de Constant to cross the Rhine. Frederick now faced several significant armies on multiple fronts in the war. Unlike years prior, he was now unable to relaunch a significant invasion into the Habsburg lands of Saxony, Silesia, or Bohemia. He was now forced to wait for Daun to launch his invasion into the Prussian-held parts of Silesia. The other issue the Prussians faced was the Russian army. Though it had technically been defeated at Zorndorf, it had not suffered a significant loss. The Russian army was now joined by a cohort of Swedish forces, now under the command of Count Pyotr Saltykov, who was a personal favorite of the Tsarina Elizabeth. The Russian army now moved to march on Berlin, coming from the Polish Commonwealth, where it was now stationed. Frederick decided to move to stop the Russian army, hearing of Saltykov's supposed inexperience. Frederick lambasted Daun, who was the commander who was in charge of the Prussian army in defending Berlin. He was reprimanded for his lack of movement. He was then replaced by Weidel, who moved with another 2,800 men to protect the Prussian capital, Berlin. Saltykov had the reputation, at least in the Prussian camp, of being a poor general. But he surprised the Prussians by outmaneuvering Weidel and his small Prussian force, and then defeated the Prussian army at the Battle of Kay on June 23rd. Saltykov now occupied the city of Frankfurt. He was now within 400 miles of the Prussian capital. Frederick, who now realized the immediate danger the Prussians faced, was forced to travel a good portion of his army in Silesia to move to meet the Russians on the battlefield. He left his younger brother, Prince Henry, to defend the Silesian province. Saltykov now held an army of nearly 80,000 men at the town of Kunersdorf. His army was held in two different lines of deployments. The Russian artillery was held at the Kiener Splitzberg and the Grosser Splitzberg. On the evening of August 10th, the Prussian army now moved from Frankfurt across the Rhine to attack the Russians held up at Kunersdorf. Frederick moved to the north of the Russians, circling around them to attack the rear of Saltykov's army from the east. He could keep a decoy of troops under the command of Falkenstein to keep the Russians occupied. But as Frederick made his way around, he realized his plan on the Russian army, to attack the Russian army from the east, that is, was not as foolproof as he thought. The Russians' defensive position was strong, very strong, and much stronger than he anticipated. What he first thought was the rear of the Russian army was actually the front of the Russian army. He now had to maneuver yet again to attack from the north. All of these maneuvers by Frederick were extremely slow and gave the Russians plenty of time to prepare for the Prussian attack. 60 Prussian guns were established in 3 batteries on the Walkterberg, Kosterberg, and the Kunersdorf. Around 11:30 a.m., these guns opened a heavy barrage on the end of the Russian position on the Mühlberg. A heavy artillery battle ensued between the Prussian and Russian armies. In the artillery clash, the Prussians got the slight upper hand. Around 12:30, Frederick's main attack began from the north, hoping to outflank the Russians. And it was this point where Saltykov understood the Prussian king's intention to outflank the Russian army from the north and used the terrain to the Russian advantage, concentrating a large number of troops in the center of the battlefield, using the large mountains on his left side and the city defenses of Kunersdorf from the right side. The Prussians were able to push back the initial Russian defenders and were able to seize the Mühlberg for a brief period. But the Russians now concentrated their main force behind their defensive positions at the redoubt, defending the city. After seizing the Mühlberg, Frederick's generals tried to persuade him to take the brief military encounter as a victory and retreat. But Frederick decided now to make his main attack on the Russian army. Frederick deployed his right wing to attack the Russian army from the east, and now made another attack on the left wing of the Russian army. The Prussian army charged the Russians, who held a significant defensive and numbers advantage. The Prussians took heavy casualties due to artillery fire and the strong Russian defensive position. The Prussian infantry and cavalry, unable to make any significant impressions on the Russian position, were collapsing in flight. The close-quarter battle significantly hurt the Prussians, who were heavily outnumbered and getting mowed down in the thousands. Frederick attempted a cavalry attack late in the battle, but it was repelled by joint Austrian and Russian cavalry units. Frederick had to be rescued from a party of Cossacks by his escort of Zetin Hussars, commanded by Captain Pritwitz. After taking heavy casualties, the Prussian army was forced to flee north and cross the Oder at Görlitz. Frederick was prostrated, both emotionally and physically, and was forced to abdicate command of his army to General Fink. Frederick now expected the Prussian state to collapse following this dreadful defeat. The Prussians lost nearly 19,000 men, while the Russians only lost about 13,500 men. This would make Kunersdorf one of the bloodiest battles of the war. A significant number of Russian forces now occupied a good portion of the Kingdom of Prussia. Frederick's empire, which he had built in 1740, was now in grave trouble of collapse. In June 1759, General James Wolfe launched his invasion into the territory known as Quebec. The British and American forces arrived and established themselves on the Isle of Orleans, downstream from Quebec, in late June 1759. Montcalm's brigade took post on the southern bank of the river, opposite of the city, and began to bombard it with artillery fire. The other two brigades occupied the banks of the Montmorency. On July 31st, 1759, Wolfe attempted an attack on Montcalm's riverside fortifications. The disorganized assault was repulsed with heavy losses. The Grenadiers and 60th Battalion lost around 500 casualties. On the night of September 4th, the troops encamped on the Montmorency. On September 12th, Wolfe was informed that the French supply ships were expected to venture down the St. Lawrence that night. A feint attack was made by Wolfe on Montcalm's fortifications, east of the city, to draw the French troops away from the proposed landing site. Wolfe formed his army on the plains in a single line of battalions, the right resting on the edge of the heights above the St. Lawrence. One light gun had been dragged up the cliff and stood between the 47th and the Highlanders. The 15th Foot was formed at a right angle to the line on the left to protect the flank. 2 battalions formed a reserve, the 3rd, 60th, and the 48th Foot. 2 companies of the 58th guarded access up the cliff, and the 3rd and 60th guarded the rear against any incursion by Bougainville. Of the brigadiers, Montcalm and Murray commanded the line, and Townsend the reserves. Wolfe positioned himself with the 28th on the right of the line. General Montcalm did not become aware of the British incursion until that very morning, when he saw the line formed just outside of Quebec. French, Canadian, and Indians streamed through the city towards the Plains of Abraham. Montcalm applied to the governor of the city for some guns from the ramparts, but the governor agreed only to release 3. Nevertheless, Montcalm decided to attack the British line. Montcalm formed his army from the right battalion of the Canadian militia, then the regiments of Bern, Lassar, Benin, Languedoc, and Roussillon, and another battalion of militiamen. Skirmishing Canadians and Indians formed the flanks. A savage fight developed on Wolfe's left between the skirmishers and the British light infantry, and the reserve regiments under Townsend. The 3 French guns and a single British gun fired at the opposing lines. The French regular battalions advanced to the attack, and the British regiments who had been lying down to avoid the fire rose up. The French fired ineffectually, but too great at a distance, and came on. The British foot withheld its fire until the range was about 35 yards. It is said 2 volleys were sufficient enough to destroy the French line. The British infantry then advanced and drove the French from the field. General Wolfe, who had been wounded in the hand, advanced with the 28th Foot until he was shot in the groin and then in the chest. A group of soldiers carried him to the rear. Canadian skirmishers continued to fire on the British until they were driven back. The French army was now in complete collapse and was forced to retreat into the city in confusion. General Montcalm, who had been shot in the hand, was carried back with the retreating throng until he was taken from his horse into a house nearby. On the other side of the battlefield, General Wolfe rejected medical attention and was laid on the ground. Someone called, "See them run." Wolfe said, "Who?" He was answered, "The French." As he was already struck, Wolfe directed the 28th to march to the bridge across the St. Charles River to cut off the retreat. This was the last order he made. Wolfe sank to his knees, and a lieutenant and the grenadier rushed to help him, initially thought that he was already dead. With blood oozing out of his mouth, Wolfe asked the lieutenant to help him get back on his feet, so that the soldiers would not see him fall. In addition to the wounds of the 2 generals, Montcalm's deputy was also killed in the battle. Brigadier Montcalm was wounded. Townsend took command and immediately had the fight immediately had to fight off an attack from Bougainville to his rear. Thus we now show the iconic image from the 7 Years' War, the painting of the death of General James Wolfe. This is perhaps the most famous depiction of the war. On the other side of the battlefield, the great French general, the Marquis de Montcalm, had been taken to a nearby house where he was treated for his wounds. Assisted by 3 soldiers, he regained consciousness, where he was taken before a surgeon, who announced that Montcalm would not live through the night. During the afternoon, the general drew on his last reserve of strength and signed his last official act as commander of the French army in Canada, in a letter addressed to General Wolfe, who, unbeknownst to him, had already died by this point. Montcalm surrendered the city. He died around 5 a.m. the next morning, September 14th, 1759. At 8 a.m., he was buried in a shell hole under the choir of the Ursuline Church. General Montcalm's remains are still held in Quebec. Montcalm's mausoleum is in the cemetery of the Hospice General de Quebec. In the battle on the Plains of Abraham, the French lost about 1,000 men, either wounded, killed, or captured, whereas the British lost only around 300 men. After the battle, the French civil governor of Canada, the Marquis de Vaudreuil, left Quebec, taking the majority of his surviving force. And on September 18, 1759, the governor of Quebec also surrendered the city of Townsend. The taking of Quebec was the beginning of the end of French rule in Canada, although the British troops would have to endure a severe winter in the ruined French city. The battle on the Plains of Abraham was the final clash between the 2 great generals of the war, General Montcalm and General James Wolfe. This would be one of the more famous battles in American history, and is known as the battle that made America. The Battle of Kunersdorf was the worst defeat for the Prussian army of the entire war. A devastating defeat within the pre-war borders of the Kingdom of Prussia. But Saltykov did not pursue the defeated Prussian force, as they had feared. This gave the Prussians a bit of breathing room. As Frederick wrote to his brother, Henry, "I can announce to you the miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Just when the enemy had crossed the Oder and couldn't finish the war, by risking a second battle, he marched in the opposite direction. I marched first to cut him off from that part of Lusitania, which was being obliged to keep him supplied." Nevertheless, the Prussian situation was still in bad shape. Frederick's kingdom was still surrounded by enemies. Frederick moved his army to Breslau in Silesia, where he was to meet Daun and his army. Upon hearing the news of Saltykov's retreat from the Duchy of Brandenburg, the Habsburg court was confused as to why the Russians did not pursue the belated Prussian army. Therefore, Empress Maria Theresa reached out to the court of St. Petersburg to reach a deal with Tsarina Elizabeth, whereby General Saltykov could move on Frederick's belated army. A deal was reached, and Saltykov moved to face the Prussian force. A good bit of positive news came back to the king of Prussia when an army under the command of Wunsch was to push back a much larger Habsburg force, which had occupied Torgau. Meanwhile, Daun's army moved to the Electorate of Saxony. Frederick sent a large force under the command of General Fink to face the Austrian army which now stayed in Saxony. On November 19th, Fink's Prussian army reached the village of Maxen to meet the Austrians under Daun. Fink's army had about 15,000 troops. Meanwhile, Daun divided his much superior force of 32,000 men to make an attack on the Prussians held up at Maxen. Two wings of the Austrian army would converge on the Prussian troops. On the morning of November 20th, the Austrians, under Daun, set off from Dippelsfeld, divided into 4 columns, headed towards Maxen, while the forces of Barinso also moved south to converge on the town. The ground, frozen and covered by a first splash of snow, made it difficult for the cavalry and artillery to move around. Daun's vanguard fired on the Prussian pickets near the village of Reichsken, who, at Fink's instructions, withdrew from the village. The Austrian grenadiers then climbed the hills behind the town, allowing their artillery to take up position on the left side of the Prussian line. Starting at 11 a.m., intense cannon fire developed on both sides for the next 45 minutes. That is, until Daun ordered the advance to be resumed. 5 battalions of the Austrian grenadiers led the attack on the hills in front of the towns of Wagensdorf and Maxen. The attack would rout the Prussian battalions that held the town of Maxen. The entire left wing of the Prussians was isolated from the right wing and had to turn north toward the village of Schmotzendorf. An artillery duel ensued between the two armies. After the small artillery duel, Daun sent his army to attack the village. Fink took the initiative and made a cavalry charge to delay the Austrian advance. Fink was heavily outnumbered at this point in the battle, and the Prussian army was taking heavy casualties at the hands of Daun's army. Fink was forced to make a hasty retreat, leaving a large number of troops to be captured by the Austrians. The battle resulted in only around 300 troops dying. 300 troops dying on the Austrian side, whereas the Prussians lost around 2,000 men in the battle, with nearly 10,000 troops being captured. Fink only escaped with around 3,000 men of his original 15,000 troops. This Battle of Maxen was yet another devastating result for the Prussians. The French no longer had any troops to defend North America. In an attempt to solve their problem, the French planned to land an army of 20,000 men in Ireland. And this force was largely assembled in the Gulf of Morbihan in southern Brittany under the Duc de Angoulême and was escorted by the Brest fleet under the Admiral Hubert de Conflans. Admiral Sir Edward Hawke's Channel Fleet, the British Admiral Sir Edward Hawke's Channel Fleet, blockaded the Brest to prevent the French from leaving to collect the troops' transports in the first week of November. Hawke's ships were forced to run for shelter in Torbay, giving Conflans the chance to escape. On hearing that the French had done so, Hawke went in pursuit, and on November 20th, sighted him 20 miles out to sea. De Conflans, relying on the knowledge, ordered his fleet to take refuge in Quiberon Bay, south of Morbihan, assuming Hawke would not follow, because both night was quickly coming on, and when he saw the area was one of ill-charted rocks, reefs, and wild seas, he realized this was a miscalculation. For Hawke relentlessly pursued him into the bay, losing 2 of his own ships on the outer reefs, but sinking the French These and Sorbet. by a combination of gunfire and the weather, otherwise decimating de Conflans' force in what became an action practically in the dark. The French flagship Sailé Royal went aground in the bay near Le Croisic and was burned to prevent the capture the following day. Others were captured, including the Heroes, which was burnt. A few French ships escaped to Rochefort, and some others managed to find refuge in the mouth of the river Velnu, where they were trapped for some months. This devastating naval defeat stopped any attempts for the French to invade North America during the 7 Years' War. This would be a devastating defeat for King Louis XV.
Our apprentice Tom made our